Hello. So one interesting aspect about culture to me is how media reflects cultural interests. So people tend to talk down about things like reality television and award shows and the Kardashians, stating how superficial and vapid they tend to be. Um, but that being said, a lot of people are really interested in these things. So I think that given their popularity, these things really reflect what a majority of a culture is interested in. So, for me, one of my big interests is horror movies, and combining that with the fact that I tend to be overly analytical, um, I think that horror is a pretty strong reflector of cultural fears or the fears of the culture in which that horror film is made. So a good, scary horror film capitalizes or captures a piece of something that the audience truly fears or is unnerved by. To a few examples, the movie Alien, from what the screenwriters have said, or one of the screenwriters has said, capitalizes on males' fear of being raped, um, which is bizarre the first time you hear it, but the more you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Other horror movies, like, say, A Nightmare on Elm Street, capitalize on our fear of how vulnerable we are while we sleep and how out of our control our dreams are. So a lot of films, horror films, capitalize on universal fears such as alienation or isolation. But there are a lot of horror films that capture a unique aspect of culture, a unique cultural fear. So, when I think of American horror films, I don't think I'm alone in believing that the slasher film is one of, if not the most prominent example of the American horror film genre. Films like Friday the 13th, Halloween, Scream, Hatchet, or a bevy of other films, and their bevy themselves of sequels, um, tend to litter the American horror film market, while foreign examples of slasher films tend to be somewhat absent. I can only think of a few, including the French film by Alexandre Aja, Haute Tension, bad pronunciation, or better known in English, High Tension. Norway's Fritt which means Cold Prey, or Iceland's Reykjavik, whale watching massacre. So these are the only ones I can really think of. I'm sure there's a couple more, but what I'm trying to say is these things are typically rarer than American slasher films, which are abundant. And I think that the American fascination with slasher films is indicative or reflective of America's fascination with serial killers, or more generally, our fear that we will be stalked and or murdered by a stranger or strangers. So while the likelihood of this actually happening is incredibly rare, we tend to focus a disproportionate amount of attention on this kind of violent crime. Given this, names like Ed Gein, Clifford Olson, Jeffrey Dahmer, or Ted Bundy can almost be considered household names. And a reflection of this somewhat bizarre fear has carried over into how we educate our children. As a child, I remember being inundated with so much stranger danger preparedness training. There were lessons about creating lists of adults who could be trusted in emergency situations. We were urged to make passwords with our parents that told us which adults were to be trusted, and also, much more generally, the types of vehicles that predators were known to use. And that's not to say that this training hasn't helped people or even saved lives. But due to how unlikely these crimes are, I think that the costs of these stranger danger lessons have kind of outweighed the benefits. So what are the costs of this stranger danger training? Well, most generally there's the loss of time, the amount of time we invested into learning about how to fear our neighbors. But there's also deeper costs, which are much less visible, I think. So there's the apprehension we feel when interacting with strange people for the first time. Our greater unwillingness to help strangers or assist people we don't know because we aren't really sure of their intentions. There's cloistering children away, restricting their mobility or their access under the guise of protection. And for me, I think that the biggest cost has been, as an adult male, feeling like any attention I pay to children in public is scrutinized and treated as suspicious. I know that this might just be me assuming the thoughts of others, but I know I'm not the only adult male that feels this way. So that brings me to Korea. Despite the presence of serial murderers occasionally in Korea, and there have been a few, and other forms of violent crimes perpetrated by strangers to the victims, this country never really got the stranger danger indoctrination that we got in Canada and the United States. And as a result, I feel like kids are able to enjoy themselves in public without as much adult supervision. It's not uncommon to see small children riding the bus by themselves, which I think is awesome to teach them independence at that age. And while most little kids in public stare at me like I'm some sort of crazy leper, there are a few who have come up to me in public and tried to interact with me. And I've had to unlearn a few things, like first of all that children who are unsupervised are under the immediate threat of being taken by some sort of crazed stranger. Or, second, that I will be assumed to be a weird person or strange person for interacting with the child. And I've learned that when people are staring at me in public, it's not because they're suspicious of me, it's because I'm just foreign. So I think that it's an interesting difference between Korea and North America, and I'm not exactly sure why this cultural difference exists. Korea has, as I've said, had several serial murderers, or other violent crimes that have been committed by strangers to the victim. Yet there seems to be much less of a fascination or less of an impact on attempts to shield children from potential violence from strangers. Perhaps it's the lack of child serial killers, where I couldn't find a single South Korean serial murderer that targeted children. In North America, we've had many, like Albert Fish, Clifford Olson, and a few others. So it could be the lack of child serial killers, or perhaps there's just some other cultural factor that's prevented South Korean fascination with violent stranger crime or serial killers. And that being said, it's nice to see children who are afforded the independence to like walk to school alone or go out by themselves. And I think it's a little sad that I've had to overcome this mild aversion to interacting with children. And I guess we'll see how that affects me when I return to Canada. So in the beginning, I was talking about horror films as a reflection of cultural interest or cultural fears. So it really begs the question, I think, if North Americans are so focused on slashers as a result of their fear of violent crime by strangers or their fascination with serial killers, then what can be said about Korea? So I'll be talking about this in my next video. So this is the first two-parter episode of this series of videos that I'm doing. So yeah, tune in whenever I post that video. Thank you.